Hi, I'm Jerry Judd, and this is Roger Telschow. And he and I, with the help of what I call a close community, have created a series of tapes seeking to show forth the soul of Shalom Mountain. And recently, the Shalom community has suffered on this plane a terrible loss in the death of Helen Kaufholz, who was a valued leader on Shalom Mountain. Her death was a major event in the life of the whole community. And we would like to dedicate this series of tapes to her memory, and to give thanks to Helen for reminding us that there is no death, that Helen's spirit abides with us still, loving and serving us, and a reminder that in her death she has reminded us that we are divine beings. Hi, Roger.
Hey, Jerry.
We've been having a hell of a good time.
We sure have.
We've been making a bunch of CDs, not CDs, what other?
Well, they're DVDs.
DVDs on the underpinnings of an institution that you and I love a lot, Shalom Mountain Retreat and Study Center. And I think, what have we done, 5 of these now?
I think it's 5, yeah.
Well, this is the last one that we're doing, and I guess appropriately, it's on death.
Seems fitting somehow. It's, as you've said before, it's not exactly a crescendo of inspiration as a subject, but maybe it is too.
Well, let's find out.
Yeah, sounds good.
What we've been trying to do is to come at the underlying theory of this institution, of Shalom Mountain, from a metaphysical point of view. Not a theological point of view in the sense of a dogma and doctrine, but of looking at human life in terms of journey, from the time we enter this phase until the time we leave it. And I guess what we're talking about today is not coming in but going out, right?
Yeah, we're talking about the mystery of what happens when we die, and how is death informing our life,
right?
I guess so. Yeah, and we finally decided that one thing you can't do anymore is die a young man.
That's right. That's I found out something I can't do. I can't die young because I'm 87 years old. That's a hell of a lot older than you are.
Yep.
And so, in a real sense, this is a conversation between a person who is in midlife and a person who is, you might say, on the shady on the shady side of the mountain.
Well, it's interesting. We were going around the table earlier about our first experiences with death.
Yeah.
And the most shattering experience I had with death was at 21. I had just turned 21 and had been married very young in college, and my wife, who was a wife of 5 months, died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage, and I had to wrestle with what this meant in my life. I mean, I was really in love with this woman. And when I met Frances, who's videotaping this, one thing I had to say to her was, I love you, and I will lose you.
You were able to say that?
I had to say that, because I think it took me until I went to Shalom Mountain to really let go of the grief and the anger and the inability to open my heart to another person. I was only able to do that after going to Shalom Mountain, so I had to say to her, I will lose you, and I choose to live with you and love you fully now.
Were you already saying to her, I will be your mate and I will love you, but I will not cling to you?
I don't know that I was that mature.
Okay, all right.
So I missed a part?
Well, I think it's an amazing thing for somebody to have to experience a death of that level of intimacy that early. So it must have been terrifying on the one hand, and on the other hand, I would think that there would be a tendency for a person that young to kind of find a compartment for this and put it in.
Well, I really didn't know what to do with it. I really didn't know what to do with it.
You see, you were in an identity crisis, and the crisis of grief is fear. You know, now what's going to happen to me? Who am I now that she is dead? And I'm pissed that she left me. She abandoned me, basically. That's the feeling of being abandoned. And the pain involved in the loss of a loved one is immense, just immense. And
you've been in these waters too.
The question is, though, what do people do in grief? And we are talking about Shalom Mountain Retreat and Study Center, and there, grief that is tucked away has a chance of emerging, and the fear and the anger and the pain that are related to grief have a chance to be put out there. And then there are a bunch of people in the group who say, wow, hey, wow, I lost somebody too. And then something opens up your heart and with that other person too, and we realize that nobody going through this plane escapes suffering. So the Buddha was right. The first principle of Buddhism is suffering. And
life is suffering.
What we do with suffering has a lot to do, in the end, with how we die. Whether we die pissed off that we have to die, whether we die angry that we're dying early or late, or that, got the crabapple two-step till I died, or whatever. How one handles grief determines how one dies.
Well, how are you doing with it?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing, on that level right at the beginning of saying, death has been a huge thing in your life. And that your spiritual life has had a lot to do with how you're handling it.
Well, it's ironic that had I not had that encounter with death so front and center in my life at an important developmental time of my adult life, I couldn't have what I have with Frances now. There's no way.
I think that's right, because your capacity to love was magnified in the wrestling with death.
Mm-hmm.
So we are dealing with a subject of huge importance here. Big time importance.
And it's a subject that's in shadow in the culture,
Right.
in a big way.
I think what I have, while I'm willing to participate in this, I think there is something to be said for an old dog to be able to say, this is the trail, this is the lane, this is the path I followed, and this is what it did for me. I mean, this is where I am. And that there is something about elders in society who can say to a younger person, this is the path I have traversed. And so when you ask me at an old age how I'm feeling about death, I'll tell you.
I know you will. And
Yeah.
it's part of the beauty of the way you deal with these subjects is you just lay it out there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, put it out and let it wriggle around there on the ground, you know, and see if it turns into a butterfly or something.
Yeah. But before we start, I'm going to turn this other light on here because I want to make sure. we have
Okay.
enough. It's getting a little darker. I think that's going to help us a little bit.
That's what a lot of people have said when I'm talking. I wish we could shed more light on this.
Well, there you go.
It's pretty good. Okay. Well, I first of all want to say that I believe that how one views death is determined by the person who is asking the question of what is death. There are some things that cannot be handled at any time in life. There is such a thing as appropriateness. And I think the early part of life is very in the development of the ego. I'm very critical of the churches oftentimes ask young people, you know, to give their life to Jesus, you know, give their ego to Jesus. They didn't have their ego yet. You know, I mean, they didn't have anything to give Jesus.
Yeah, what can you give up if you haven't developed it?
Exactly. So I believe that spiritual wisdom not only has to do with length of years, it has to do with the development of the spiritual life of the person. So the question that is asked about death and the answer that is given that is satisfying is very much determined on who the person is who is asking the question. And so I would say that I began, my father was a pastor, and so funerals were a part of the family scene. But my first encounter with death was with my cat that died. We never knew how he died, but when he was dead, he was dead. I mean, it was very clear that he was dead. I mean, he was so soft and furry, and then the next day he was stiff as a board, you know. And I still remember his mouth was wide open, like he was saying, you know, to hell with this. I mean, this is rough business, whatever was happening. But anyhow, I took the cat to my father, and, you know, like a kid would, he just brought it.
What age would this be?
About 5. And so he took this as a teaching opportunity, you know, like we parents have always watched for these teaching opportunities. So he got across to me the idea that I was going to die too.
Yeah.
And I thought about that, and then I said, I just won't do it. Yeah. And I haven't yet.
You've been true to your word.
No, up to now, my father, though, is watching. I think my father knew all the time that I was kidding. So
we're not so sure. You're still doing yogic headstands at 87, so
yeah.
you may just be going for it.
Yeah, well, this is true, but I'm also, beside being a romantic, I'm also a realist. And I know that in a few years, the reason why these buzzards are flying over our house, they're in cahoots with the Undertaker.
Yeah.
And so I am very much aware that my time is limited. Now, the guy who is condemned to death, who is in, for killing somebody or something, I mean, he can always appeal.
Right.
There ain't no place for me to appeal. I mean, my appealing days are over.
Yeah.
So I just want to say to you that it's been a great trip, and the steps in my journey were, first of all, my cat. Secondly, the funerals in the church where my father was the pastor. Then my father's death between 14 and 15. And then a death was all that time academic, even though later on I was studying as a theologian. But it remained academic until with 3 little kids and a wife that I loved a lot, I had just been elected the first general secretary of the new United Church of Christ. And a half an hour later, I was sitting with the then president of the church, and a waiter came up to me and said, "Do you have a phone call?" So I went to get the phone call, and at the phone was a guy with a glass of whiskey. And it seemed a little weird. And on the other end, the guy said, "I'm Dr. So-and-so from New Haven Hospital, and there's been a sailboat accident, and your wife is dead, and your kids are alive." That's what he said. And the guy tried to get me to drink the whiskey, and I didn't do that. So I went back and reported what was going on, and I went up and packed my bag and got on the first flight to New Haven. And the guy who was on that plane was no longer the same guy that was there a half an hour before. He was now if you took a brick and threw it through a glass window, there I was on that plane, and what do you say to your seatmate when you're going home and your wife is dead? So that experience forced me into, first of all, taking all of my resources that I had to survive and be the caretakers for my children, and at the same time set me on a new journey, asking the question. Now remember, this is not just grief, this is serious grief. So that the question was, now who am I? Because Esther and I bought into the idea that the twain shall be one, and now the twain wasn't there anymore, and who was the one now that the twain was gone? So I would say that was the most important single event of my spiritual journey.
You speak of it as your shattering.
What?
You speak of it as your shattering.
Shattering, that's right. The next most important thing for me in regard to death was that I became a person who was going to save the world. I had been a pastor who was into saving the family. Then I graduated into saving the whole world and everything that was wrong with it. And the Vietnam War, B and I did a 3-day fast at the river entrance of the Pentagon, and the police would come and haul us away, and we would go right back. And they couldn't take us away because the Pentagon belongs to me as a United States citizen. So then we slept in a home for broken for women who had been abused. That's where we slept at night. We fasted all day. Well, we drank water, but we fasted for 3 days, and we had a sign on our back, "We hunger for peace." And Bob Scanlon, who's a policeman, I don't know but he came and sat with us for a while. It was nice to have another Shalom person. And we sat there for 3 days, and at night we would hear children giggling and laughing in this home for abused women. And we never saw one single smile in 3 days of people going into the Pentagon. Not one. But the Vietnam War, women's rights, racial revolution, was all I was out there saving the world. And
how did this bear on your relationship to death in that time, the Crusader part of your life?
Well, I was fighting death.
I wondered, yeah.
I was fighting death, and it was in some ways very commendable, and on the other hand, it was sad, because I know now I cannot save the world. I cannot save the world. I have a lot of allies out there, and I send money to all my allies, and I pray for them, but I'm no longer saving the world, because I decided to find out how to find salvation for myself that was not just told to me by somebody else. I wanted to find salvation in my own experience. And so, since at that time I could go anywhere in the world to whatever seemed interesting in regard to church and culture, so I went out to Esalen, and
Would this have been the early 60s? Or?
Well, no, it was in the latter part of the 60s, around 67, I think, something like that. And as I often say, I mean, you didn't have to bring your own pot, because was surrounded by hippie wagons, and everybody was smoking, and you just breathed it in and felt cheerful. And then we sat in the hot tub at night, and that opened up my eyes to see things I had never really looked at before, including my own body. And then we were taught massage, and here I was massaging this woman I only met, half an hour before. And all of a sudden I became more conscious about the body. And then I had been a really strict monogamist, and then I got laid at the University of Chicago celebrating the 300th anniversary of the Unitarian Church. I was a turn-on artist for that outfit, and there was this beautiful woman sitting across giving me the eye, and eventually we tumbled into bed, and this was an incredible, like, everybody needs to be taken across a river. She took me across a river.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't tell Elizabeth at that time, because I thought this was just a kind of a wonderful mistake I had made. But then about 6 months later, I was giving a lecture at the university, and there she was sitting in the back, and we started up again. Now, this all happened to me in my body, and it opened up my spiritual journey in a very dangerous way that involved suffering, but it opened it up, and we got into goddess worship, which was at that time also very wonderfully satisfying, but was a form of idolatry also. At any rate, by getting deeply involved in the sexual revolution, I got deeply in touch with my own body. Not somebody else, but my own body. And now you can see a journey that has been going like this going like that. All of a sudden, a whole new world opened up because I was getting in touch with my body. And as I've said in these other tapes, the issue of matter and spirit is the central issue of the spiritual journey. And anybody who does not meet at that cross, because it is a cross where the horizontal and the vertical come together. And this cross, the ancients knew this cross long before Christianity was ever heard of, that this cross between the horizontal and the vertical has to be traversed, and that on this plane I had to learn, in order to find God, in the sense that I have now found God, I needed to traverse this plane. Mm-hmm. So that the next stage of my journey was, you know, you always teach the thing that you need to know yourself.
Right.
That's why I founded Shalom Mountain, because I wanted to find out how suffering can be faced creatively so that it becomes a part of our power instead of our weakness. So Shalom Mountain became big for me because there never was a single mat trip where I was not the biggest learner. So that was part of me in death, because it was a part of me in life. Now you see me moving more and more toward life and more toward the celebration. And when I left Shalom Mountain after 15 years, the thing I missed most was laughing for 3 days and dancing for 3 days and being in community that could only be called authentic, real, loving community. Then Georgianne and I moved here to Telschow, and I began to take vibration seriously as to what, because now I'm into not what are the doctrines of God, not what are the doctrines of God, not what is the dogma about God, what is the experience of God. And all my life, since I was born into a Christian home, there's never been a time when I have not been asking the question, how do you love God? And I have now at last found out how to love God so that I am satisfied. I am satisfied, and my journey's over. My journey is complete, in the sense that I've found out how to love God, and in learning how to love God, I have learned how not to fear death anymore. Mm-hmm. So ask me, how do I feel?
That's pretty big.
I feel good about death. I feel anytime I'm ready to go, and I'm not in a hurry, because I'm having one hell of a good time right now.
Well, it's interesting, this shift that I'm hearing. You know, here you were for many years pastor of a church, brought up in a family with a pastor for your dad. You had a lot of exposure to death. You had a lot of, you said you even sometimes would bury 80 people a year in your church.
Right.
So you had a lot of exposure to people who had committed suicide, all different ages dying, and you had to, give them the last rites.
Babies dying, children dying, young people dying, old people dying. That's true.
And yet there's something about the way you speak about death now, and the way you have this in a visceral sense. You have your relationship to death held in a completely different way.
That's right. It's held now loosely. Yeah. It's loose. It's very loose, and it's very satisfying. I mean, I just love that word satisfied, don't you?
You do.
I mean, oh man, I'm telling you, to be satisfied is absolutely marvelous. it's something. It's something that it's hard to find little kids, you know, when they're 7 or 8 or 9 years old, satisfied. I mean, there's something always not satisfying, always something. And
Well,
so we're built that way.
When we're on the ego journey,
Yeah.
we're never satisfied.
Never. That's exactly
There's always a hair in the soup somewhere. Even if we
That's right.
we set out, we achieve every goal we ever wanted, there's still something incomplete, and there's always a reaching and a hunger for something else. But I don't hear that in your voice. When I talk with you, I hear this is a genuine...
You know about the guy who went actually, he went to have dinner in this fancy restaurant, and he found a fly in the soup. And he called this waiter over, and he said, "There's a fly in my soup." And the waiter says, "Shh," said, "Everybody will want one." So that's the way it is when you go to a fancy restaurant and when you live a fancy life. And I have lived a fancy life, and I'm telling you, first of all, before we get any farther, that the word satisfied is it, and feeling good is it. And when you're feeling good, you're not feeling bad. When you're feeling good, you're not feeling bad. And feeling good is it. So I believe that I have concluded at the end of my days that the summum bonum of my life is feeling good. And I don't want to feel good sometime. I want to feel good all the time. And mostly I do.
Yeah.
I'm having a hell of a good time as an old man. I want to say that to everybody. You can be old and have a happy time. You can be old and really get off on things.
You're one of the happiest individuals
I'm the happiest person I know.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody happier than me.
Well, it's very magnetic. It really is, because I want some of that. And I think a lot of us do, and a lot of us are puzzled by the way we go on our journey, and I think we live in fear of death. I think we live in fear of a lot of things. And
Loss.
Yeah, loss, and there's something that you have here in this morning practice that you do that connects the dots for you, and you seem to experience God every day, and then bring that into every moment of every day.
I can't say a lot about this, in this kind of a speech, but it is true that it is possible to get your body so in tune with the 7 different energy centers that you move from all flatness into a state of pure love, pure joy, and pure peace, and to know that that's it. When you got it, you got it, and to just be glad you can do it. And then now my big question always is, how can I maintain this when I go upstairs? My office is downstairs, and Georgianne's doing her disciplines upstairs. Georgianne's reality and my reality, even though we are mates, there are 2 different realities. So how can I come upstairs and maintain this ecstatic, high level, feeling good all day long? And as a theologian, I first went to the Old Testament, where God feeds the children of Israel manna. Remember, he fed them manna in the wilderness? And he said, now I'm going to give you this bread. Read energy. I'm giving you this bread today, but you can't hoard it in your pantry. In other words, you may get a whole lot and put it in your pantry just in case there won't be enough tomorrow. He said, you can't do that. You can only get enough for one day at a time. And so I decided to go to the Old Testament one better and not do it 6 days, because they said on the weekend, you know, you can get enough for 2 days.
Oh.
That was what God made a little
deal there.
little deal about the weekend. But I decided to go to the Old Testament one better and do it 7 days a week, and not so that I have developed a theory of energy that God gives us enough energy for the day, for that particular day that we're in. But we need to be open to receive it. And how do you receive energy into your body? How do you receive energy into the 7 chakras? And it's cute. I mean, once you get into this kind of excitement of spiritual journey, something new happens every day. And something new and exciting happens every day that never happened before.
It's like we're dying if we're not being reborn every day.
That's right.
That's what I'm hearing.
That's right.
And
That's right.
saying yes to death.
To allow oneself to be reborn and to recommit. No, to surrender. Because there's a lot of different. In a way, I'm committed to my discipline so that I've hardly ever missed a day of doing an hour and a half of discipline. But there's a lot of difference between committing, and just saying, well, you know, this is one of the things that I do. When you commit, you give it everything. You give it everything that you've got. And that means in arranging how you do your work, in approaching your work. And one of the things that has moved me toward life and away from death on this plane has been doing the next thing. And do the next thing without judgment. And do the next thing without judgment. And without criticism, and without being pissed off that the tractor's wheel fell off, and just say, well, the tractor's wheel fell off. Next thing to do is to get somebody smarter than you to put the wheel back on. That's all.
It sounds very Eckhart Tolle.
Oh, yeah, what?
It sounds very much like Tolle, who says,
Tolle, yeah, sure.
You know, resist nothing. Embrace the events in your life as though you chose.
That's right. Them. I think the best way to be happy about death is to be happy about life. And the better time you can have in this life, and the more authentic you can be, and the more real you can be, the less you have to worry about death, because you're satisfied.
And you said if you don't want to fear death or live in the shadow of death your whole life, then die while you're still alive. And that's again touching into the ability to build ego and then transcend ego and allow ego to fall away is really the death. Is that the death you're speaking about?
I think the death of the ego is a pretty high experience. It's not something that a kid could do, or a person who had not yet developed a strong ego. I think the stronger your ego, the more likely you could surrender it. But because your ego, you have to have satisfaction that you did develop your ego, you know. You said this is, you know, and when you've got a good, strong ego, you know who you blame? Nobody. You don't blame anybody for anything anymore after you got a strong ego. Because you take total responsibility for your life, and you messed up. You say, I messed up. That's it. I messed up. Because I messed up, I got a right to mess up. I'm a human being, but I'm not going to spend much time on it. I'm going to get back on course. And so getting back on course is how to move toward joy and love and peace, and it is a way to make friends with death. To make friends with death. And I want to go back to what we are really doing here is we're developing these tapes to tell people out there that there is an amazing institution in the Catskill Mountains called Shalom Mountain Retreat and Study Center. And there you can come and be real. And there you can come and face your fear and anger and your pain and realize it without knowing it, that you have been grieving all along. That you have had a serious case of grief. And that there it can be laid out, and nobody's going to say, you shouldn't do that. But everybody's going to say, wow, wow, thanks. That sounds like me, you know? Because we're all in this together, and nobody can tell us how to do it.
You know, what's occurring to me here is that it's so beautiful when you can walk to the edge of your existence and actually say, I'm going to allow this to be in my life, whether it's the facing of death or grief or what have you.
Yeah.
It gives us life. Because there's a fear in each of us that we're going to slide down that slippery slope. God, if I ever really got into the grief that I feel, there's sort of a knowing somewhere back in us that there's all this grief. Don't want to even get started because I'm afraid I'm going to slide down into oblivion. But to really tread in those edges, those edgy places, and then to be able to be held in community. I mean, it's the same as looking at death while we're alive. It gives us life.
Also, I think one of the things that moves us toward life is our willingness to give up punishment, to give up. When you're a little kid, if something goes wrong, somebody's got to be to blame. So,
Right.
you know, this is part of our enculturation. If something's wrong, somebody did it, right? And if somebody did it, somebody's got to be punished. And so we have a whole world full of people who spend time blaming other people for their life. Now, there isn't any doubt that we impact each other. It's just that blaming somebody else don't mean nothing. I mean, it doesn't get anybody anywhere.
Doesn't move anything.
It makes me feel so sad that even the New York Times, they love to write these stories about how we executed this guy and how the blood ran down his nose and got on his shirt, and how the needle didn't go in quite right, and how the guy jerked around like a chicken. And then the people who wanted this guy dead get to watch this guy do that, and then they go home. And they think they're going to feel better now because they saw the blood run out of this guy's nose. And that's a kind of a paradigm of when the towers came down, we didn't say, well, hey, wow, we should have international conference on terrorism because something happened to us and it's very likely going to happen to you, and maybe we can figure out how to do this. No, we had to punish somebody, and we couldn't punish the Saudis because, you know, they were our dear friends, so we knocked out Iraq. So the whole business of punishing is deeply ingrained in our society. And we believe that if we can punish somebody else enough, we're going to make ourselves better, we're going to be more fully alive. We actually, when we keep punishing other people, we just move away from life.
We punish ourselves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think that giving up punishment, and that also, I think, is giving me pause in regard to me as a politician. I'm surprised at this late age that this is coming to me, but almost all foreign policy is built on correcting error. Somebody else, not our error, but somebody else's error, correcting it, right?
Right.
And this doesn't produce anything but more and more wars. That's all it produces. And in our nation, the policy in regard to the country is all built on correcting errors, Instead, we need politicians who will emerge to create a dream of the future for the people on this little blue planet. Before we destroy ourselves, we need a new vision of how can 6.5 billion people live on this little bitty blue planet. And how can, when a child is born in the world, that this child has a chance to develop its gifts? Where are these politicians who helping us to dream
I'm
a whole new dream?
I'm starting a campaign to draft you.
Wow, right.
Get this going.
Right. Of course, I'm not the only guy saying stuff like this. There are people everywhere saying stuff like this. But let's pray for the emergence of leaders who are not just on error correction, but who can spin a dream, who can spin a new dream for us.
Yeah.
So,
can I take you back to death for a minute, and we'll probably
sure.
end up. But you know, it's
no sweat.
It's such an inspiring subject.
No sweat.
I said something earlier. I asked you, does God die? Does God die?
Well, that's a tough one. It's not an easy question. But I have an answer that satisfies me. May not satisfy anybody.
That's all we need.
I believe that God is eternally born. That God is eternally nurturing and sustaining the universe. I believe that God is eternally teaching, that God is eternally suffering, and that God is eternally rising. Dying, and God is eternally rising again. That this is going on all the time, and that as one moves along in one's journey, all of a sudden God may be dead. And then he may be peeking around the corner again, down the line. Your beloved wife may die, and then God's peeking around the corner again. So I think to take God seriously is to give up the whole idea that there's somebody up there keeping a record, and everything that you did and you didn't do right, and you didn't, you're going to get swatted, and you're going to go. I never could believe in hell because I didn't believe the Constitution could stand it. And I still don't believe in hell. But I believe if we could give up the idea of the punishing God, and if we could give up the idea that somebody else can tell us the answer. I hope you hear me saying that. I don't believe anybody else can give you an answer that's worth a damn. I think you point and you find it that this is your answer, then you got something. Right. But as long as the other guy's answer and he's trying to shove it down your throat, it ain't going to do much good for you.
Got to go inside.
So the issue of the God who is dead is interesting for us theologians to monkey around with. But my message here at the end of my life is to say, you have been born to journey, so journey. You've been born to journey, so journey.
Get on with it.
And don't take somebody else's journey, take yours. And don't think by your marrying the woman of your dreams that you got it made. Because you can't take her journey either, and she can't take yours. It's a hard word. But I think we have to take responsibility for everything in our life, and then we become responsible, and then we say, I'm not waiting for Georgianne to make me happy. I'm not waking, and Georgianne's not waiting for me to be happy, make her happy, because we are each on our own journey, and we wave and we have wonderful times together. We're still on a journey to what? To the one. That we are one, and God is one, and hallelujah.
Thanks, Jerry. And I just thank you, too, for all the time that we've spent over these, I guess, about last year and a half, doing all these videos.
That's right.
It's been exquisite.
By the way, I want to say I think we've done one hell of a job. I do. I think it's just been great. And in a real sense, it turned out even better than we planned.
Well, it's real. You know, it's really.
So we can say, what the hell? We had a good time doing it.
Yeah, it's all that counts.
And it could be, it could be that something that you said or something that I said may really hook somebody out there. And they say, wow, you know, I'll go down this road.
Yeah. Also want to just thank your wife, Georgianne, and Robert Close for setting these things up, and Frances Gates, my wife, for doing a lot of the videography, and Barra Khan has done some of that as well. And a lot of other people who've supported this along the way and who've participated.
Yeah.
So, you know, thanks to everybody. It's been a gas.
So if you and I have had a good time, we've already won, and we'll hope something else comes of it.
Yeah. Yep.
I'd like for the folks to see Georgianne. You think?
Yeah. Let's bring her over here. This is her spectacular painting over here.
Right. And I thought, well, she's sitting here. Are you sitting here, Jay? I don't see you there yet. There you are. You want to say something to her, or you want to?
I'll just bring the microphone out here.
Okay.
So you can say, hello, Georgianne. We have a new guest on our program today. Before we take a break. But your home here is graced by all of these magnificent pieces of art. What's the origin of this one here? I mean, what is the energy that's gone into that one?
I saw this, but much more beautiful than I can paint it. And what I saw, I think, was I guess the personification of everything in a way, all energy, all things, so that in a way I could feel connected. So that I painted a piece of this, but what I saw was the grass dancing and the corn and everything being just like me. And I suppose the message to me was that I'm part of everything and everything's a part of me. So I think that's what I paint.
It's powerful work. It's wonderful. We panned it, I think, at the beginning of this DVD. So thank you. Thank you for having us in your home here all these times. It's been really great.
It's been great.
I want to say just a little bit about living with Georgianne as an artist. I see what artists try to do is they try to put out there for us to see what cannot be put into words. And now I live with Georgianne's art every day, and the pictures that are in this room are especially dear to me. But this one, I think, I would say is my favorite, and it might be a good way to end this tape, to say that in this painting is the reconciliation of matter and spirit. And if some people who are ready want to look at this picture, they might see, that it is a very sexual picture. It is very matter. And it is a very yogic picture in the sense that the furnace, there is a kind of a focal point down here of the first and second chakra, and you become aware of the furnace of the body, and then move up into the solar plexus, which is the center of the will and the center of the ego. And then you move up here and you get the fourth chakra of the heart, which is involved in all of our affectional world and in some of our thinking world, probably much more than we may imagine. And the throat chakra then becomes the place of communication with God and longing for God. And the third eye becomes the center of the intellect, but also spiritual wisdom. And then the top is the merging with God. Now here's a picture of matter, of the human body, and how it works and how energy flows. But that the real reconciliation of matter and spirit is moving into the transcendent and being lost in God. So this is that fabulous piece of work, and it's got a lot of juice in it for me.
Well, maybe we'll just end with a shot of that artwork and know that Jerry and Georgianne's bedroom here is considered one of the most erotic places on earth.
Good point.